A peace president starts a new war, and somehow his support doesn't collapse. In Europe, that makes no sense. Support remains strong for the so-called peace president, elected on promises of lower prices and no more wars, even as he launches a new conflict, threatens extreme escalation bordering genocide, and sends gas prices soaring. It's baffling. Many commentators here in Europe struggle to find a coherent explanation. Maybe you can explain to me why. That's the question I want to sit with today, because I think there is an explanation, and it's more unsettling than most people want to admit. First, the scene. In late February, strikes began on Iran. By April 7th, there were reports of hits on Karg Island, Iran's main oil export terminal, alongside public language warning that Iran's entire civilization was at risk. A ceasefire was announced that same evening. Then, 6 days later, U.S. Central Command announced a naval blockade of ships entering or leaving Iranian ports. The consequences arrived immediately. Oil prices surged back above $100 a barrel. NATO allies, including the United Kingdom, publicly refused to join. Major wartime leadership changes at the Pentagon had already unsettled observers. The International Energy Agency signaled readiness to release emergency reserves, a step reserved for genuine supply shocks. Higher fuel costs, fraying alliances, escalating risk. Every metric the administration said it wanted to improve has moved in the wrong direction. So let's take the strategic argument seriously, because it has a coherent internal logic. Iran has spent decades waiting out American pressure. The argument goes, incremental measures don't work. What changes the calculation is genuine unpredictability, convincing Tehran that the cost of non-compliance could be catastrophic. In this framing, extreme rhetoric isn't recklessness, it's leverage. Reuters reported that White House officials themselves described the most alarming public statements as deliberate negotiation tactics designed to make Tehran blink, not as a literal statement of intent. That is a recognizable playbook from crisis bargaining theory: create overwhelming pressure, then offer the off-ramp. There is a version of this that could work. The question is whether the conditions for it are in place, and the evidence suggests they are not. Here is where the logic strains. Coercive pressure depends on the opponent believing you can absorb the standoff's costs better than they can. But polling tells a different domestic story. A Pew survey from late March found nearly 7 in 10 Americans worried about rising gas prices from the conflict, and only around 1 in 3 confident in the administration's Iran decisions. A CBS YouGov poll from early April found roughly 2/3 saying the goals of the military action have not been clearly explained. And yet, Republican approval of the war sits near 70%. Among those who identify most closely with the MAGA movement, an Economist YouGov survey found support approaching 75%. This is the core of the puzzle. The war is broadly unpopular, but it is intensely popular within a specific, cohesive coalition. And in a polarized political system, survival doesn't require majority approval. It requires keeping your coalition intact. Political psychology helps explain the rest. When partisan identity is strong, people interpret the same events through entirely different frameworks. Escalation that reads as reckless to one group reads as strength and resolve to another. The rhetoric that alarms most observers signals something different to supporters primed to read unpredictability as strategy. There's also a structural trap. Public threats, once made, are costly to retreat from, even when conditions worsen. The more maximalist the language, the harder de-escalation becomes, without it looking like capitulation. That's not a glitch in the strategy. For some, it is the strategy. So I'll leave you with the question underneath all of this. If a policy generates the exact costs its supporters say they oppose, higher fuel prices, more conflict, but support holds anyway, what does that tell us about the relationship between outcomes and political loyalty? Is this a story about geostrategy, or is it at its core a story about identity? That distinction matters enormously for how this conflict ends. If this gave you something to think about, subscribe and pass it on. I'll be back with the next episode.